What if everything you thought you knew about the birth of Christianity was incomplete? We often imagine the early apostles as brave, gentle men walking hand in hand with God, but history tells a far more fractured, brutal, and unlikely tale. One man, once feared by Christians more than any Roman soldier, would become the architect of the faith itself. His name was Saul, Saul of Tarsus, a name that sent shivers down the spines of early believers, because Saul didn't just disagree with Christianity, he hunted it. He arrested its followers, dragged them from their homes, and watched with satisfaction as they were condemned. He believed he was doing God's will, until a voice from heaven stopped him cold. What could make a man go from zealot to apostle, from imprisoning believers to writing the very scriptures they would live by? This is not just a conversion. It's a story of identity shattered and rebuilt, of betrayals and brotherhood, of shipwrecks and letters that would outlive empires. But it's also a story of wounds that never fully healed. Today, we uncover the radical, raw, and rarely told truth of the man who helped build the church, on the very foundation he once tried to burn down. This is the epic transformation of Saul, the man we now call Paul. Before Saul became a name whispered in awe or fear, he was simply a son of Tarsus, born into a world torn between ancient faith and brutal empire. The Roman world of the first century was a powder keg of political instability and religious upheaval. Jerusalem, the beating heart of Jewish identity, was under Roman occupation. Pagan altars stood not far from the sacred temple. Tensions simmered between the Jewish elite and restless zealots. And in the middle of it all, a small, subversive movement was beginning to grow. They called themselves followers of the Way. Men and women who believed that Jesus of Nazareth, a crucified rabbi, was the Messiah. To Rome, they were nobodies. To the Jewish establishment, they were heretics. And to Saul, they were a contagion. Raised a Pharisee, trained under the famed teacher Gamaliel, Saul's world was one of precision, law, order, and purity. A new sect undermining the Torah was not just wrong, it was dangerous. And Saul? He would be its cure. But while he sharpened his resolve in Jerusalem, something larger stirred beneath the surface. Christianity was not dying, it was spreading, and Saul, unknowingly, was about to become the flame that made it explode. He watched with a cold heart as Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was dragged into the streets, surrounded by a furious crowd. Stones flew, blood spilled, and Saul approved, not silently, not reluctantly. He held the coats of the executioners. That day wasn't a tragedy for Saul, it was a beginning. Empowered by religious authority, he became the face of persecution. House to house, synagogue to synagogue, Saul searched for followers of the Way. Men, women. It didn't matter. He arrested them, imprisoned them, shattered families. The early church trembled at the mention of his name. But then, the road to Damascus. Saul had received letters giving him the authority to arrest believers in Syria. He set out full of pride and purpose, convinced that every step brought him closer to righteousness. But God had other plans. A sudden light, a blinding flash. Saul collapsed. His eyes burned, but worse than blindness was the voice that followed. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. And the voice, it called itself Jesus. Everything Saul had built his life upon, his education, his power, his convictions, was torn down in an instant. He was led, trembling and blind, into Damascus. For 3 days he neither ate nor drank. Alone in darkness, he was left with nothing but questions. But there was one man brave enough to approach him, Ananias, a disciple of the very movement Saul had sworn to destroy. God spoke to Ananias too. "Go," he said, "for Saul is my chosen instrument." Imagine the fear, the confusion. Ananias obeyed. He found Saul, laid hands on him, and said, "Brother Saul, the Lord has sent me." Brother. In that moment, Saul's sight returned. But more than his vision, it was his soul that was healed. He was baptized. and from that day forward he would preach the name he once tried to erase. But not everyone was ready to forget. The disciples were suspicious. The Jews were outraged. And Saul, now Paul, was caught in the middle. He had become a man without a country. For safety, Paul vanished into the deserts of Arabia. He stayed there for years. Scripture is silent on what happened in that time, but scholars believe it was there, alone, wrestling with his guilt and calling, that Paul received the revelations that would change the world. When he returned, he wasn't just a convert. He was a man on a mission. Paul would not be content with preaching to Jews alone. He believed, radically, that the message of Jesus was for everyone, Jew and Gentile, slave and free, man and woman. This was not a small idea. It would spark arguments, councils, and even confrontation with Peter himself, but Paul didn't back down. He set out on what would become the first of 3 missionary journeys, each one more daring, more dangerous, more defining than the last. In Lystra, he was stoned by an angry mob and left for dead. But somehow, he survived, and returned to preach in the very same city. In Athens, he stood before the Areopagus, the philosophical elite of the ancient world, and declared the unknown God they worshipped had a name: Jesus. In Ephesus, he challenged the powerful cult of Artemis. A riot broke out. The entire city was in chaos. But Paul stood firm. He wasn't just preaching. He was planting churches, building communities, writing letters that would outlast emperors, letters we now call Scripture. But even as Paul's influence grew, so did his burdens. His letters, brilliant and theologically rich, weren't written from ivory towers. They were written in moments of crisis, heartbreak, and deep concern for real people. To the Corinthians he wrote of division and discipline. To the Galatians of freedom and faith. To the Romans, he laid out the very foundation of grace. And yet, even with divine wisdom pouring through his pen, Paul never pretended to be perfect. In a deeply personal confession, he spoke of a thorn in the flesh, a torment he begged God to remove. But the answer he received wasn't healing. It was warb. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. What was the thorn? Physical pain? Mental anguish? Temptation? We don't know, and maybe that's the point. Paul, the tireless traveler, the eloquent teacher, the unshakable apostle, still suffered, and in that suffering he found the humility and dependence that defined his faith. But his path would grow darker still. In Jerusalem, Paul was arrested after a violent uproar sparked by false accusations. The city turned into chaos. Roman soldiers intervened, barely saving him from a mob that wanted blood. He stood trial before Felix, then Festus, then Agrippa, governors and kings who held his fate in their hands. At every turn, Paul defended his faith with clarity and courage, but when it became clear he would never receive justice, he made a bold move. I appeal to Caesar, he said. As a Roman citizen, it was his right, and it meant one thing: Rome. But getting there would not be easy. Paul boarded a ship as a prisoner. The voyage was treacherous. Storms pounded the vessel. Supplies dwindled. Despair crept in. Then, disaster struck. The ship was shattered on the rocks of Malta. It should have been the end. But Paul survived. And not only survived, he brought hope to those around him. He healed the sick. He preached the gospel. And when he finally arrived in Rome, it wasn't in chains of despair. It was with the unbreakable resolve of a man who knew his mission was not yet finished. Under house arrest, Paul wrote what are now known as the prison epistles, letters to the Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. They were filled with joy, instruction, and the unmistakable peace of a man who had made peace with his path. But his freedom wouldn't last. Some years later, the city burned. The Great Fire of Rome consumed much of the city, and the Emperor Nero blamed the Christians. A new wave of persecution began, and this time Paul wasn't spared. He was thrown into the Mamertine prison, a dank underground cell beneath the city, cold, cramped, and cruel. Here, in the final days of his life, he wrote to his beloved disciple Timothy, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." These were not words of defeat. They were a declaration, a final testimony from a man who had seen it all: miracles, mobs, revelations, betrayals, and had never turned back. And then he was gone, executed by beheading according to tradition. No grand farewell, no last sermon, just a quiet, brutal end. For the man who once silenced Christians with violence and then gave his life to amplify their voice. Yet his legacy, his words, his courage, his vision, still echoes through the halls of history. The Apostle Paul did not merely spread Christianity, he shaped it. His letters form the backbone of Christian theology. His missions pushed the gospel to the ends of the known world. And his transformation stands as one of the most powerful proofs of grace ever recorded. From killer to saint, from feared to revered, from Saul to Paul. And perhaps the most astonishing truth? It wasn't just his theology or travels that changed the world, it was the man himself. Because Paul's story is not neat, it's not clean, it's not the tale of a perfect hero rising above adversity. It's the story of a flawed, fiery, relentless soul who was broken and rebuilt by love. And that is why it endures. Because every one of us, no matter our past, no matter our mistakes, can find a mirror in Paul. We too carry regrets. We too long for purpose. And we too can be changed. Paul never forgot who he had been. He called himself the chief of sinners. He carried his past like a scar, not as shame, but as a symbol of the mercy he had received. And perhaps that's the final, most profound lesson. That the gospel isn't just for the good, it's for the worst of us, for the persecutor, the broken, the proud, the lost. Paul's life proves that transformation isn't just possible, it's the very heart of the Christian message. So what part of Paul's journey speaks to you most? Is it his blinding moment of truth on the Damascus road? His courage in the face of persecution? His letters, filled with love and pain and truth? Or perhaps it's simply the idea that no one is beyond redemption. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What struck you most about Paul's journey from destroyer to builder? And if this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to the depth and humanity behind the pages of the Bible, then join our community. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and walk with us as we explore more stories that shaped the world and still speak today. And if you're ready to dive deeper, check out our documentary on life under Roman rule, so you can see the world Paul lived in with new eyes. Every watch, every share, every subscriber helps this message reach further. So thank you, truly. And remember, grace isn't about who you were, it's about who you're becoming.